He pressed the doorbell 3 times in quick pulses that sounded like trouble, and when I glanced at the intercom screen and saw my best friend's brother standing there with rain in his hair and a look that was part apology and part dare, I knew this visit would not end quietly. His shoulders looked tense, like he was still carrying the weight of whatever had happened before he made his way here, and something in me already understood that tonight would be different from all the other nights we'd carefully kept our distance. By the time I opened the door, his expression had softened just enough to reveal relief beneath the tension. When he said my name, his voice was steady, but his eyes darted past me into the warm light of my apartment like he was searching for permission. I stepped aside without thinking, the faint brush of his arm against my chest sending a warmth through me that had nothing to do with the heating. We had known each other for years, enough barbecues, birthdays, and casual game nights to fill an album of safe, group-friendly moments, but there had always been something about the way he looked at me when no one else was paying attention. Tonight, standing in my doorway with rain dripping from his jawline, he looked less like my friend's brother and more like a man who had come here for reasons that had nothing to do with politeness. He muttered an apology for showing up uninvited, then laughed under his breath at himself. I told him he never needed an invitation. His eyes softened at that, though he tried to hide it, and I led him to the kitchen, the one room where conversations tended to turn honest. I poured him tea without asking how he took it, because I already knew. He wrapped his hands around the mug like it was the first real warmth he'd felt all evening. When I asked where his brother was, he shook his head and said they'd argued about nothing and everything, the kind of fight that lingers long after the words have run out. He spoke in fragments, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug, pausing like each sentence risked revealing more than he intended. I listened closely, hearing the way my name hovered on his lips in places it didn't belong, as though he kept catching himself before he let the wrong truth slip. The rain against the window filled the spaces between our words. My apartment felt smaller, but not in a suffocating way, more like the world outside had been pushed back, leaving just the two of us and the soft lamplight. When he asked if he could stay just for an hour, I told him the couch was ready and the sheets were clean. The exhale he gave wasn't just relief, it was surrender. We carried blankets to the living room, his hand brushing my wrist in what might have been nothing except I knew it wasn't. He sat down at one end of the couch, but by the time we'd talked about the weather, his brother, and the latest movie neither of us had seen, he had shifted close enough that our knees touched lightly. He didn't move back. "You've always been easy to talk to," he said suddenly, his voice lower now. The way he looked at me wasn't casual, and it wasn't something we could laugh off later. I felt the weight of it, and maybe he did too, because he leaned back slowly, like he was giving me a chance to pull away. I didn't. The hour he'd asked for slipped past without either of us noticing. By then, we were sitting so close that the blanket draped over us didn't just keep out the cold, it kept in something we'd both been ignoring for too long. And when he finally looked at me again, his eyes held a question neither of us had dared ask before tonight. The rain outside had shifted from a steady fall to a softer drizzle, but it was still enough to turn the windows into silvered glass, reflecting the lamplight and the two of us sitting far closer than we had any reason to be. He'd relaxed into the couch now, one leg folded under him, the blanket slipping slightly from his shoulders so I could see the way his t-shirt clung to him after the walk here. He was telling me more about the fight with his brother, though it wasn't really about the argument anymore. It was about how he felt, how he always felt like the odd one out, the one who didn't fit the way he was supposed to. His voice had the low, unhurried tone people get when they're finally saying things they don't say anywhere else, and I found myself leaning in without realizing it, not wanting to miss a single word. "You ever feel like you're living in someone else's shadow?" he asked. His eyes were steady on mine, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. "Sometimes," I said honestly, "but sometimes I think the shadow is safer than the spotlight." That made him smile, not a big grin, but something small and private, like we'd just agreed on a secret. His gaze dropped briefly to my mouth before he looked away, rubbing his thumb against the seam of the blanket. I felt the pull of the moment, the way silence had stopped feeling empty and started feeling charged. He shifted slightly, his knee brushing mine again, this time more deliberately. "I didn't mean to end up here," he said, "but I think I needed to." His tone was softer now, like the words were meant for me alone. I told him he could stay as long as he wanted, and something in his shoulders loosened, the kind of change you notice more than you see. He set his mug down on the coffee table and leaned back, the blanket falling even lower, exposing the curve of his collarbone. My eyes lingered a little too long, and when he caught me looking, he didn't seem in a hurry to break the eye contact. We talked about everything and nothing, movies we'd never seen, vacations we wanted to take, old stories from the years we'd known each other, but underneath it all was that unspoken thread we didn't pull on yet. I could feel it tightening with every glance, every pause. Near the end of the second hour, the conversation shifted. He asked me if I remembered the first time we met a summer barbecue, years ago, and I said I did. What I didn't tell him was that I'd noticed him more than I should have that day, and maybe every day since. He smiled like he already knew. "I thought you looked at me differently," he said. I tilted my head. "And what if I did?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the blanket and pulled it higher, tucking it around both of us, his arm brushing against my side. The closeness was sudden, the kind you either step away from or sink into. I didn't move. The rain picked up again, harder now, the sound filling the room. His voice dropped low enough that I almost had to lean in to hear. "If I stay tonight, is that going to be a problem?" The question hung between us, heavier than the air, and I felt my pulse quicken. Whatever answer I gave would change the shape of the night completely, and we both knew it. He didn't look away after asking if staying would be a problem, and the way his eyes held mine made it clear. He wasn't searching for permission as much as he was checking whether I could carry the weight of the yes I was already giving. I told him the couch folded out, and that the extra blanket was softer than it looked. And even though those words were ordinary, the tone behind them wasn't, because the moment I said them, we both felt the room shift into a quieter temperature that promised a different kind of night. He angled his body toward me as if the question had loosened a tight hinge in his chest, his knee pressing lightly against my thigh under the shared blanket, and the tiny contact felt louder than the rain that was pushing at the windows with a steady, unembarrassed insistence. We didn't lunge into anything reckless or fast, because neither of us wanted to spoil what patience had been building for years. So he kept talking in that low, deliberate voice, while his fingers traced the seam where the blanket met my wrist, a careful line that mapped the distance we were about to erase. He told me that fights with his brother followed a script that made both of them sound like younger versions of themselves, which meant it always ended with one of them walking out and the other standing at a window pretending the glass could fix the past. I told him that being in the middle had taught me how to listen without choosing sides, but it had also taught me how to hide my own feelings in a drawer I only opened in rooms where no one could hear. And as I said it, I realized this room had never felt more private than it did right now. He smiled in a way that looked like relief, disguising itself as gratitude, then shifted closer until our shoulders touched, his warmth soaking through the cotton of his shirt and into the thin patience I had been wearing like armor since the night we met. "Do you remember the storm last fall?" he asked. "The one that knocked out the power, and you found those candles in the back of the cabinet?" And I said I did, and I didn't add that I remembered the shadow of his face moving across the walls more than the flicker of any flame. The hour he had asked for had long since stretched into 2, and somewhere between the tea cooling on the table and the rain gathering in the gutters, we stopped arranging our sentences to protect anyone who wasn't here. He told me he was tired of being the brother who always seemed too much or too little depending on who needed what, and I told him I was tired of being the friend who looked away at exactly the right time, as if kindness were the same thing as refusing to be seen. He laughed softly at that, not because it was funny, but because truth often sounds like a joke when it first learns to speak, and his hand slid from my wrist to my forearm with a slow, careful pressure that felt like a door being pushed open by someone who had finally decided to come inside. When I turned toward him, The blanket tightened across our laps, pulling us closer without any visible effort, and he watched my mouth with that focused attention people reserve for last lines and first kisses, even though neither of us had moved far enough yet to claim either. "Staying won't be a problem," I said at last, and the breath he released landed warm against my cheek, a small, grateful weather that made the rest of the apartment feel like a background we could edit later. He nodded once, a tiny, decisive motion that looked like a promise folded into a yes, then reached to tuck the blanket more securely around us, his knuckles grazing my ribs in a light, unsteady path that made my own breath misbehave in a way I didn't try to correct. We sat like that for a long minute that felt like a saved photograph, the lamplight soft and the rain persistent, and his thumb began tracing slow circles at the inside of my elbow with a tenderness that said this wasn't about winning anyone's approval anymore. It was about learning how to hold something we had both been carrying alone. He leaned in a fraction, the kind of small movement that becomes monumental when everything around it is quiet, and the look on his face made it clear that if our mouths met now, it would be because we had finally stopped choosing the easy version of ourselves. The universe, which has a sense of humor even on the best nights, decided that was the moment for his phone to buzz against the coffee table with a skitter that jolted us apart by an inch, but not a decision. He stared at the screen without touching it, the lit rectangle reflecting in his eyes, and I didn't ask who it was because the answer was written in his shoulders, which had tensed into the shape they always take when he is expected to be a brother before he is allowed to be anything else. "Don't hate me," he said, not because I would, but because history had taught him that choosing himself came with a price. And then the phone buzzed again, longer this time, like a knock that wanted to be a command. He reached for it, thumb hovering over the call, and the tiny pause stretched into a fragile bridge where the night could either cross into courage or retreat into the same polite ache we'd been babysitting for years. He let the call fade into silence, the screen going dark like a stage light dimming between scenes, and when he set the phone face down, his hand found mine without theatrics, his fingers lacing through in a patient bind that said, "I'm here, and I'm not apologizing for it." The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. A dozen unsent messages replaced by a single shared breath, and he tilted his forehead to mine with a careful closeness that felt more intimate than anything reckless could have been. "I don't want to make you choose," he said, voice low enough that only the space between our mouths could hear it, and I told him he wasn't asking me to choose. He was asking me to be honest, which was somehow harder, and also exactly what I wanted. He smiled at that, small and real, and the room seemed to lean toward us, as if gravity belonged to our side of the couch now. The blanket, a warm, conspiratorial roof over a truth that had finally learned how to breathe. The phone buzzed again, one insistent pulse that cut clean through the moment, and this time his brother's name lit the screen, bright and undeniable, hovering between us like a line we could step over or step back from. His eyes met mine with a question that wasn't about the call at all, because we both knew the conversation waiting on the other end would change the shape of the night, and maybe the week, and certainly the way we explained this chapter of our lives. He swallowed once, thumb poised, breath shallow, the rain louder for a heartbeat, and I felt his grip tighten just slightly around my hand, as if bracing for the choice he had always avoided at the last second. The phone buzzed a fourth time, stubborn as old habits, and he drew in a steady breath, lifted the device, and without breaking eye contact pressed his thumb down. He didn't put the phone to his ear right away. Instead, he let it ring once in his hand, holding my gaze as if to anchor himself before stepping into whatever storm waited on the other side. When he finally answered, his voice was calm but edged with a restraint that told me this wasn't going to be a short conversation. "Yeah, I'm here," he said, his tone steady in a way that felt practiced. I couldn't hear his brother's words, but I could see them in the way his jaw shifted, in the way his eyes narrowed just slightly before softening again. Like each sentence was both a punch and a pull. His thumb traced absent circles against the side of his leg. A tiny, unconscious motion that made me want to reach over and stop it, not to quiet him, but to remind him he wasn't alone in this room. The conversation wound through pauses, interruptions, and those half-laughs people use when they're trying to stop an argument from becoming something uglier. Once, he glanced at me mid-sentence, his eyes holding mine for just a second too long, and I knew without hearing a word that he was deciding how much of this night he was willing to protect. When he ended the call, he let the phone drop to the couch cushion instead of the table, as if putting it too far away might tempt the world to step back in. There was a quiet beat where neither of us spoke, the only sound the rain still pattering against the glass. And then he let out a breath that sounded like relief wrapped in exhaustion. "Sorry," he said, though we both knew he wasn't apologizing for the call itself. He just needed to be heard. I nodded, leaning forward a little, and the shift closed the space between our knees under the blanket again, that unplanned contact stirring the same electricity we'd been skirting all night. "You're good at that," I said, "being there for people even when you're not sure you should be." And I saw something flicker in his expression, pride maybe, or the ache of realizing someone had been watching all along. His hand moved almost without thinking, finding my wrist under the blanket, fingers warm and sure, and the way he looked at me then wasn't careful anymore, it was deliberate. We didn't rush it. There was no sudden lunge or reckless move, just the slow, steady gravity of two people who had run out of reasons to stand apart. His thumb brushed over my skin once, twice, and each time it lingered a little longer, the pause between breaths, stretching into something that felt like a choice. "I'm not leaving tonight," he said finally, his voice low but clear, and that one sentence carried more weight than the entire phone call before it. I didn't answer right away, letting the warmth in my chest speak first, letting the room settle into the kind of quiet where decisions start to take root. Outside, a car passed, its headlights briefly sweeping across the wall, and in that moment of shifting light, he moved just enough to close the gap between us. It wasn't a kiss yet, just his forehead leaning toward mine, his hand sliding up from my wrist to cradle the side of my jaw, his eyes searching mine as if to make sure I was still with him, and I was. Completely. The blanket slipped slightly, our shoulders now pressed together, and I realized that whatever this night turned into, it had already crossed into territory we couldn't walk back from without leaving something behind. He didn't take his hand from my jaw right away. Instead, he let it linger there, his thumb moving in slow, almost thoughtful strokes that made it impossible for me to think about anything beyond that touch. The space between us had already thinned to almost nothing, and the quiet in the room seemed to lean in with us, like even the air wanted to know what would happen next. "I should probably," he started, but he didn't finish the sentence, maybe because the end would have been a lie. Instead, he gave a small, quiet laugh, the kind you let out when you realize the thing you've been resisting has already happened in your mind 100 times before. I felt it, how his shoulder pressed just slightly harder into mine under the blanket, how his breath came slower now, as if his body was already answering for him. Outside, the rain eased, but the stillness it left behind was heavier, thicker, and he shifted just enough that his knee brushed mine again. It wasn't an accident, not this time, and when I didn't move away, he tilted his head like he'd just been given permission without a word. His hand slid down from my jaw to rest against the side of my neck, warm and steady, and I knew in that moment that this was no longer about comforting him after an argument. It was about the thing that had been building between us for far longer than either of us wanted to admit. "I meant it," he said quietly, his eyes not leaving mine. "I'm not leaving tonight," and the way he said it didn't feel like a warning or a question. It felt like the start of something neither of us would be able to undo. He stayed close after those words, his eyes steady on mine like he was waiting for the smallest sign I might take them back. But I didn't. I leaned into that closeness instead, letting my shoulder settle against his, the quiet weight of it saying more than anything I could have put into a sentence. The blanket slipped a little as he shifted, not enough to uncover us completely, but enough for me to feel the faint brush of his arm against my side. That touch barely there pulled up 100 small memories I hadn't let myself replay before now. The way his hand sometimes stayed a second longer than it needed to when we greeted, the glances that stretched just a moment past comfortable, the smile that always felt a little private even in a crowded room. "I didn't come here to start something," he said softly, though there was a quiet curve to his mouth that made it clear he wasn't planning to stop anything either. He shifted again, this time turning to face me fully, his knee bumping mine under the blanket and staying there, a gentle anchor. The faint stormlight from outside traced the edges of his face, catching on the sharp line of his jaw before slipping into shadow, and I caught myself staring, forgetting to look away. When his hand found my thigh, it wasn't quick or uncertain. It was slow, careful, as if he was giving me the chance to move before it became something we couldn't undo. I didn't move. Instead, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, and the air between us thickened with the kind of silence you don't fill with words. Outside, the wind had gone still, the rain only a faint patter now, and in that cocoon of quiet, I realized we weren't just avoiding the storm, we were standing right in the center of it. He didn't move his hand from my thigh, and I didn't make any effort to ease away from it. Instead, I let the weight of it stay, steady and warm, a quiet promise in the dim light between us. The blanket shifted again as he leaned in just a little more, the fabric brushing against my arm and trapping the faint scent of him soap, rain, and something that made my chest tighten without warning. "You sure you want me to stay?" he asked, his voice low, but there was no uncertainty in it, only an almost dangerous kind of curiosity. I could have answered with words, but I didn't trust them not to give away more than I meant to, so I nodded instead, slow and deliberate. That was enough. His hand slid just slightly, the movement small but full of intent, and his eyes stayed locked on mine like he was measuring every reaction, memorizing it. The storm outside had almost completely died now, but the stillness it left made the air in here feel thicker, like every breath we took was shared. "I've thought about this," he said, the words slow, careful, as if each one carried weight. More than I probably should have. My chest tightened again, not from surprise, but from the strange relief of hearing out loud what I'd been thinking for months. I leaned in then, closing the last inches between us until my knee rested against his, until his breath brushed warm against my cheek. There were still 100 reasons to stop, and I could feel every single one of them in the back of my mind, but none of them felt stronger than the pull between us in that moment. When his forehead touched mine, it wasn't rushed or reckless. It was deliberate, a slow shift into something we couldn't take back, and my hand found the side of his shirt, without thinking, just to feel the solid, quiet warmth beneath it. He didn't move away. He didn't even blink. He just stayed there, close enough that I could feel the faint tremor of his breath as if he were already bracing for whatever came next. His hand stayed where it was, warm against my thigh, as if it had decided on its own that it wasn't going anywhere. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, the quiet filling with all the things we'd left unsaid over the years. Every glance, every almost touch, every moment when we'd both felt it but walked away before it got too close. When he finally leaned in, his cheek brushed mine first, the faintest graze, enough to send a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool air outside. His other hand found my hip, steady but not demanding, guiding me just slightly closer, until our knees bumped and stayed there, anchored in the simplest kind of contact. "I didn't plan for this," he murmured, and I could feel the honesty in his voice. This wasn't a game, and it wasn't just the result of a bad night with his brother. "Neither did I said back, my words quiet but certain, "but I'm not sorry it's happening." That made him smile, soft and brief, before his forehead rested against mine again. We were close enough that I could feel his breath mixing with mine, close enough that the faint sound of rain against the window seemed a mile away. The first kiss wasn't rushed, it was slow, almost cautious, but it carried the weight of all the restraint we'd kept between us for years. His lips were warm, the pressure light at first before it deepened, and my hand slid instinctively to the back of his neck, feeling the tension there melt beneath my touch. Outside, the night moved on, cars passing distantly, leaves rustling in the wind, but here, in the dim light of my living room, the world had narrowed to just us. And when we finally pulled back, breathing a little heavier than before, there was no trace of hesitation left in his eyes. He didn't leave that night. We stayed there, talking, kissing, and letting the hours stretch into morning, the space between us never more than an arm's length. And by the time the sun began to pale the sky, I knew something had shifted for good. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't going to fade when daylight came. If you stayed with this story until the end, drop a comment so we know exactly who felt the pull, the risk, and the change all the way through.